Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Nelson Mandela Bay Business Chamber. My name is Calvin Naidu. I'm the acting president, and I'd like to welcome you to to today's program in conversation with Dr. Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, the role of ethical leadership in South Africa's development, being hosted by BDO and facilitated by Sia, the managing partner of BDO in Port Elizabeth. Dr. Geraldine, I feel uncomfortable addressing you as Geraldine, even though that's the way you introduced yourself, because anyone growing up in my generation, at the risk of giving away my age and yours, would know your name intimately well. And I was at university in the early 90s during those turbulent years, and your name is well known to me and respected by the people of my generation. So I am grateful for the opportunity to meet you and grateful for the opportunity to host you. Geraldine is a well-known former member of the South African Parliament, having served, get this, 3 consecutive parliaments from 1994 to September 2008. She served with Presidents Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki. She served in the South African government as Deputy Minister of Welfare and Population Development, thereafter as Minister for Welfare and Population Development. Subsequent to this, appointed as Minister of Public Service Administration for 2 consecutive terms until her resignation in September 2008. During her tenure as Public Services Minister, she served as Chair of the Pan-African Ministers of Public Service for 3 consecutive terms. In addition, she was appointed to the United Nations Committee of Experts in Public Administration, a subsidiary body of the United Nations Economic and Social Council. She served on the board of the Commonwealth Association for Public Administration and Management, was a member of the advisory board for the Institute for the Study of International Development, McGill University, Canada, and served on the Africa Advisory Board of Women's World Banking until December 2018. That's just her public roles. In addition to that, Geraldine was the former Global Director of the United Nations Development Programs Democratic Governance Group, former Vice President, Special Envoy on Gender at the African Development Bank, Chancellor of the Nelson Mandela University, non-exec board member of Standard Bank Group, Standard Bank South Africa, and the lead independent director of Exaro, and chairman of Tiger Brands with effect from 1 January 2021. This is one of the most impressive CVs I've ever read. If you are looking for a job, please consider me. Thank you very much, and I'm grateful for the full attendance. Dr. Fraser-Moleketi, that's because of your presence that we have this level of attendance, and thank you very much for joining us. Sia, over to you.
These are roundtable discussions that we normally host at BDO in partnership with the Nelson Mandela Bay Business Chamber. Usually it's behind the scenes. It's in a boardroom, just the cameras. And usually I'm not as nervous as I am because I know that everything is going to be edited out. Now today, for the first time, we have an audience. Dr. Fraser, welcome. I think I'm honored to be a person that's going to be interviewing you today. You are actually a chancellor at NMU, Nelson Mandela University. It's actually a university that I went to. Originally, I'm from Durban. I found myself in Nelson Mandela Bay, not by mistake. It was a properly planned move from Durban to Port Elizabeth, and I actually studied at NMU. I must say it's one of the best universities. I owe NMU my career. Currently I'm a chartered accountant. I'm a managing partner at BDO, looking after the Nelson Mandela Bay office. Dr. Fraser, today we are going to talk about ethical leadership. I think it's a very complicated and difficult topic considering the times that we live in. I'm tempted to say not only in South Africa but internationally, we all know what's happening in the US, and we all know the response that the different governments in different countries, how they're responding to the situation in the US. But maybe before I ask you a question about that, as Kelvin has said, I mean, you've served during the time of Nelson Mandela and during the time of also former President Thabo Mbeki. Would you mind just maybe giving us a background with regards to that? How was it like? What was their leadership style? The ethics around everything that they did to try and pull the country out of what it was pre-1994 to what we had hoped we were going to be at as a country currently.
Thank you, and thanks for this opportunity. I think it's great that you're an alum of Nelson Mandela University. I actually presided over graduation this morning, and it was just amazing to see this graduates coming through from undergraduate to even the doctoral, one of the doctoral graduates. So Nelson Mandela University is, I think, a great university, and we're still going to see some of the best in South Africa come through, following on the others who've been there. So what has it been like to work with and under the leadership of, I think, two great statesmen of this country, but also leaders who had come through, if I can use the term loosely, come through the movement, had been part of a struggle for liberation. And I think we mustn't underrate that, because that also very clearly points to the kind of leadership and ethics that are required. I mean, you don't do things at a whim. You don't occupy leadership because you think this is about career politics. You do it because you actually believe in a need for changing society for the better. And when you give not only part of yourself, but almost everything, I think that shows to a very different approach to both leadership and leading, as well as to governance. So I'll start with an anecdote about President Nelson Mandela. And I think something that's not much spoken about is I was amongst those who were responsible for coordinating Chris Hanni's funeral. And when I got a call on the morning of the 10th of January, 1995, the call came from then Deputy President Thabo Mbeki. And he said to me, I'm calling you because President Mandela wanted me to speak with you because he's decided that you should be Deputy Minister for Welfare. Now, my first thought was they were calling me because Joe Slovo had just passed away a day before, and they probably wanted me to coordinate that funeral. So it was always about expectation that links to almost servant leadership, if you can call it that. And there I'm talking about myself in terms of serving. And here was someone who I think is so profound that he's had, and here I'm talking about President Nelson Mandela, he's seen as an icon globally. And he's seen as an icon globally because of his approach to serving, giving everything of himself and expecting very little or nothing in return. And this very little is, and I should probably rephrase that, what he wanted in return was transformation of society, transformation of the South African society, transforming it into what has been captured in the Constitution, where you don't do things for the sake of complying. You do it because you see it as necessary to change the fabric of society. He didn't tolerate shoddy work from anyone. He, together with the likes of Governor Mbeki, Umgov, Raymond Mhlaba, you couldn't come 10 minutes late. I mean, if you were late, just don't come or have a very good reason for that. But also expected whoever served, and this was a characteristic both of him and President Thabo Mbeki, is in the area that you have been appointed to, you must know your stuff. Don't ever go with half-baked ideas. So you don't go to him when called and simply assume you can waffle around issues. Don't go without being ready to push the boundaries. So both of them demanded a lot in terms of professionalism, but they never spared an inch on themselves. So what they expected from others, they lived out. So what would one call that kind of leadership? It's very easy to say it's ethical leadership, but sometimes that's seen as a tagline, and in essence, it's about living in a way that you believe society should be conducted. And I hope that I've answered. So what are the differences between the two? I mean, President Mandela was also very impatient, more impatient than people assumed. And as we always said, that impatience would come through. Whilst on the other hand, President Mbeki was someone who would listen, let people speak. But again, for both of them, you need to be sure that you understood your topic, that in the areas that you were allocated to serve, that you carried it out. You carried your work out. So, I mean, if called by President Mandela, I mean, I always used to, when he said, I'd like to meet with you, the first question I would ask the department that I was executive authority for was, what are the outstanding issues that we had to deal with? The next question was the current projects we're dealing with. Where are we at with it? What are the achievements and where are the challenging, where are the rub points on it? And when arriving in the meeting, I'd find that it's something completely different. And I'll give you one example. In 1996, he decided in 3 weeks that he wanted to have a special birthday for not for children who were disabled, otherwise abled, but quite severely so. And he wanted to do it in the Kruger National Park. And he called, that was one of the reasons he called me. He said, we're going to get this done. And I said, but it's difficult because we'll really have to provide all services to take a group of kids. He says, no, we'll do it. And we did it. And you know, there is one of the quotes from President Mandela is, nothing is impossible until it's done. It's something I'm paraphrasing. And that was his approach. And we went to the Kruger Park, and he sent a note afterwards to me that I framed. And he said, you know, those kids will never forget that they've been in the Kruger Park because they've never had an opportunity to be there. So it's someone who also lived out what he believed was important, not just at a theoretical level, but at a very practical level for, you know, intergenerational groups. I mean, he loved kids because he was denied having access to kids for the 27 years that he was imprisoned. And he lived that out when he came out. And for me, the question is, how many people do that? So I haven't fully answered your question, but you'll have to pursue that further.
No, thank you, Doctor. I think you have. I think you're obviously describing the two great leaders I think we've had as a country, Nelson Mandela and then moving on to Thabo Mbeki. But it seems at some point we turned a corner, and we are where we are currently. And I believe
I don't know if you call that turning a corner.
Yes,
But,
in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
In the wrong direction in terms of, I guess, having those the leaders that you're currently describing. I guess then the question is, how do we go back to having the leaders, not just in politics and government, but the same applies to corporate. I mean, you serve in a number of boards. How do we then go back into a position where, as a country, we are having those leaders which are ethical, the leaders that are able to basically drive the agenda of looking after and taking care of the people?
You know, it's the issue of accountability. And I think when I go back to both President Nelson Mandela and President Mbeki, they were very clear that they are accountable to the people of this country. And they also accountable at different levels to whether different structures and so on. But I think it's also just a sense of self-accountability as well. And I think that's missing. Because, and let me use an example. I always say South Africa has about 1.1 million public servants. And that's national and provincial. It excludes local government. And every South African has a relative who's in the public service. Do we hold our relations accountable for the areas where they work? Or do we get them to join everyone in lamenting challenges that are around? So even this corner that we turned, whether it's a short left or otherwise, it was the minute communities decided not to hold people accountable. It's the minute we feel we're not accountable to anyone. And I think that's important. So let's go to cabinet and let me say the Mbeki cabinet. When you came to cabinet, you had to ensure that any proposals that you brought to cabinet had been well, how do I put it, you know, that we had really worked on it with rigor. And not only with the rigor required, but that we also looked at the costing of whatever proposal came up. So you couldn't just come with policy proposals without looking at costing those proposals, because the big question is who's going to pay and where's the money going to come from, you know? Because at the end of the day, any policies that are implemented must be funded. So there's accountability at that level. But cabinet wasn't there to go and argue your book only. You also needed to study all other documents coming before cabinet so that you can engage with colleagues, because this is a peer setting. You debate in cabinet. You don't debate through the newspapers. And at the moment, we're seeing too much brinkmanship, where everybody wants to say, you see, I am the great guy, but Geraldine is actually useless. And I don't think that's a strength. I think the strength is holding the collective accountable. And the collective in turn has got to ensure that the administration delivers. It goes back to my point. The relatives that work in government, in the administration or in local government, or are you ready to excuse them and they say, no, you see, we've got this hopeless manager. And you say to people, in your accountability, how do you feel at the end of the week? What have you done that week? Have you really worked in a way that you've earned your salary? Or is there this attitude of a job is a job? At a point in time, we said the public service must be the employer of choice. An employer of choice so that a seer comes into a public service, as well as anyone else, irrespective of their age. And people can come in and use it as a revolving door. So let me use health. You have doctors coming from abroad to do internships at Bara. The reason they do that is not because they love South Africa or Bara necessarily, not necessarily, let me not overgeneralize, but it's because they'll have an experience there that prepares them for practice anywhere else. So similarly, if our medics go through the public sector, and when it's well functioning, it prepares them for specialization and private practice, not only in South Africa, but anywhere in the world. But I think sometimes we lose that, and we shouldn't just place it on someone else. We should also place it on ourselves. It's what we do. How do we hold ourselves accountable? Or do we see compliance as compliance without looking at what the importance is, not only of compliance, but ensuring that we do things right, because we believe it's correct?
I think also on the topic of holding leadership accountable, I just want to be naughty and bring Kelvin into the discussion and Alfie. So Alfie is the CEO of Algoa. I think from a media point of view, just maybe to understand from a media, how do we keep our leaders accountable? And we're not only talking about government, we're talking across the board. And maybe when you're done, Alfie, just giving the response. And Kelvin, I mean, you're the acting chairperson of the Nelson Mandela Bay Business Chamber. I think from a business point of view, as businesses, how do we hold each other accountable? And also, obviously, how do we then hold our leaders in government accountable?
See, in answer to your question, I think from the perspective of the media, there's a couple of things that we must just say up front. I mean, I'm very pleased to be the MD of a radio station that has over time become a media house, a media company. But I think we need to draw distinction between the media and social media. And I think that's where a lot of populist politicians and a lot of speak is happening around government and service provision, etc. In reality, traditional media, unfortunately, has taken a massive knock world over because of money and because of social media and because of online presences, etc., etc., et al. But having said that, to answer your question, firstly, we believe in reporting the facts, doing so fairly accurately and in context, all the while serving the interests of nation building and a better life for all. If you approach it like that, 9 times out of 10, you're going to end up appeasing your audience, but at the same time appeasing many of the provisions of King. Because you're going to have to act ethical in order to get facts across. I think where the challenge lies is if one looks at what's happening on a global scale, and it was evident during the previous election in the United States, where you've got different newsrooms. South Africa is a little bit of a different, I don't want to say animal, but South Africa is a different playing field where you have a public sector, you have a public broadcaster, you have independent media, but you have media houses strewn throughout the country. I've always maintained, and it's been 35 years in this industry, that as a media and as people who have to comment socially and try and help your audience understand what's actually happening, be it on a political level or from the perspective of service provision, that you need to have an opinion. But you need to be very careful of how you share that opinion when you're discussing current affairs, because you don't want to load anything. But one of the things that I've always had a problem with is we shouldn't be speaking about, example, the municipality, the provincial government, or the national government. We should be speaking to the doctor's point about the people that work at the municipality, the people that work at provincial government, the relatives, the people that we can influence around the coffee table and around the braai. It's fundamental that as a country, we need to hold the media accountable, but at the same time, we need to hold the people that are supposed to be serving the public accountable for their daily actions. And I sit here sad, like everybody in the room, I'm sure, to hear that we still have people that are on suspension, full pay, on the taxpayers' money. It has not been dealt with by the current leaders in any of those institutions. And frankly, it's shocking. Where's the service provision back to the taxpayer, the ratepayer? Deal with these issues. Take a decision. Rightly or wrongly, it's better to take a decision than not to take a decision. I don't know if that really answers your question, but ultimately, if you're going to try and walk away from bias, you need to report the facts. And if you can't report the facts, you need to move along.
No, I think it does. I think just want to hear then from Kelvin from a business point of view.
Thanks, Sia. So over the years, things have changed a lot in business, in industry. For my sins, I carry the honor of having Enron as one of my clients many, many years ago. And subsequent to that, things like Sarbanes-Oxley came into place. In South Africa, we had some of the toughest legislation that came into place, with King 3. So then we were forced by rules to behave. If any company can survive an audit by yourself, whilst acting or behaving unethically, then there's two failures. There's a failure of the company and the failure of the audit body. But also what's changed over the years is information. If I do something wrong running my business, it's minutes these days when everybody knows about it. So that affects my future earning potential, or if it's me personally, my career. So social media, legislation, audit standards, and I believe we have some of the strongest audit standards in this country, generally keep us behaving ethically. It's the wrong reason. We should be doing it in any case. But that's where leadership development becomes important. So there's a principle I like to follow, very similar to what Dr. Geraldine is talking about. So uncomfortable. Let me compromise and say Dr. Geraldine has been talking about. There's a principle of ownership, right? My definition of ownership is accountability, even if it's not your fault, right? We're very quick to find a reason for our bad behavior rather than just accepting it. So with legislation, with audit standards, with social media, with information that's readily available and readily spread, the bad actors are forced to behave well, right? And I think that's the important thing here. It's legislation, information, audit standards that forces the bad actors to behave well. The good people, they're good. They'll do the right thing. And what we're looking for in business is I'm looking for people who will comply with the spirit of the law, right? I will always have people who don't want to accept that, but then I want to force them to comply to the letter of the law. So over the years, if we take the last 20, 30 years of evolution of business standards, business was forced to evolve with the changing standards, changing legislation, changing audits, and I think that's to a large extent has has kept most companies honest. But on the other hand, you still get Steinhoff, you still get Enron, you still get, I'm scared to say because they sit in the building, but the Gupta scandal and those kind of things. So those things still happen. So we still got a lot to learn. Now, every time there's a failure like that, we're going to go back and look at the standards, look at the legislation, and try to close the loop. So the more we're closing off the loop we do, the more control we will get in place.
Thanks, Kelvin. Dr. Fraser, I think the two responses that we're getting is, I mean, you've got Alfie from a media point of view, who's saying, look, we need to report on the facts. But the problem is that after reporting on the facts, nothing gets done. Versus in business where, yes, I understand that we shouldn't be living by checks and making sure we've ticked, we've signed. But from a business point of view, there's auditors like myself that will come in and audit Kelvin and then issue a report. Even myself as an auditor, I tend to believe I have an auditor because I report to EBA, who is the body that governs us, to make sure that we behave ethically. So it seems that there's checks and balances from a business point of view. However, from a government point of view, even though, Alfie, we do report on facts, even though the Auditor General comes and they issue a report in Parliament and say, look, we've got a problem, nothing seems to happen. How do we fix it? Yes.
I want to pick up
Yes.
some of the issues raised. And on the issue of the media and the importance of the role of the fourth estate, I'd also want to add that we're in an age of misinformation and disinformation. And I suppose it's also important for you to wade through that. So it's not as though reporting on the facts are always as easy as it seems, because it depends where you source your facts from. And I think the big issue is, are you comfortable that there's sufficient verification done, and verification of facts as well? Because it's almost too easy to say that the one side has it all right and the other side has it all wrong. So that's the first one. The second issue as well is you don't give up on the first shot. So accountability is also just keeping on. And I do want to say that in the public service, there are also checks and balances. The fact that people may not have applied it doesn't mean it's not there. So I think there's a whole range of issues to deal with, but I think you wanted to come in on the first point I made before I continue.
Doctor, yes, I think you're absolutely right. We do live in a world of fake news and misinformation, and it unfortunately has been going on for quite some time. In reality, and only each newsroom can speak for itself. I know in our case, we like to verify from 3 separate sources before we run with something, which is why, and I mean, we were talking about the great Madiba earlier, on the news of his passing, we actually put the news out an hour and a half later than everyone else, and we were actually asked why, and we said it's because we wanted 3 separate sources. We believe in being right rather than being first, and it's fundamental because we also serve a public. Although we're not a public service, we are, because we are also seen as a service provider that is a necessity. So we take it very, very seriously, and that's why we would like to verify through 3 separate sources before we run with something. It's different when the business chamber comes to us and says, this is how we feel about X. We know that that's how they feel. But when it comes down to things that impact on the greater public, if you're not verifying from 3 sources, you do have a problem. And I agree with you wholeheartedly also on the principle of compliance isn't the be-all and end-all, because ultimately, why are we complying? That's the question. We are complying because there's an intention. And I've always believed this. It's the same thing with employment equity. It's the same with broad-based black economic empowerment. The intention and the principle should not be lost in translation when you apply the legislation or you choose to be compliant. And I think ultimately this is where both for media and for business, and I fall in both spheres, the difference, but there's a difference. Management is a job, leadership is a choice.
Mhm.
And I think fundamentally where we're going to be coming to is how do we get children, the smallest of children, to make that choice to live ethical lives, and how that influences up, because that's really the root of all of it. It's very difficult to take someone who's 40, 50 years old and make them change their minds about public service. And what you said earlier about being the choice, the first choice employer, I think in many cases it is the first choice employer, because even during COVID, salaries weren't cut. And even now that the GNU is saying, cut your costs, and maybe now I'm moving on to other turf, but I think key to this is ethics is a choice. And if we can all make that choice, the country will be much better off. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to come to business, and I'd agree with the examples that you've given around business. But the reality is, look, even the auditing industry had gone through major knocks because of the roles they played or didn't play at given points in time. Because if you look at the Steinhoff example, I mean, they had some of the greatest CAs and others around the boardroom table. And you say to yourself, but what went wrong? And it again goes back to accountability. Or maybe a culture that was there in the boardroom, and a culture from the CEO, and I'm putting that as a maybe. And if you look at that, and there's books that have been written on this, so I'm not saying things that are not known, it's to what extent do we intervene early enough when there are clear signs that there are challenges. And it similarly goes back to the public sector. So there are challenges, and maybe you have appointments of people out of turn that shouldn't be appointed in a particular position. And these need to be dealt with. Does the private sector move as fast as it should? Not in all instances. And there are ample examples of that. And I think it's to get that culture. So to the point you've raised, I mean, the big issue, especially if we're saying that we want kids to grow up and understand that it's important to be ethical. It's similar for business, civil society. I mean, non-governmental organizations, to say there must be a cultural, an ethics culture within, where we all feel we should be accountable for what we do. And yes, there are standards in place. And yes, we have king. And some may consider it a big pain. And if you are a listed company, it's quite rigid requirements. But as you point out, it's not simply complying because we have to comply, but it's also because we want to grow the economy. So on the last point you've made, and maybe I'm going to do a tongue-in-cheek response to you. So you say the GNU wants cutting of costs, but that's always been there in government. If you look back, and I think if you look at studies, research reports that had come of the first 10, 15 years, there was a time when there was clearly a sense of team to get things done, you know, and where there was greater accountability. So it went off the rails. And then we become factional and partisan. And we decide, okay, should I back you or should I back him? Rather than saying, let's hold everyone to the same standards. And I think that's what's required at this point. So yes, we have a GNU that's quite diverse, and we mustn't confuse it with the first GNU. It's very different animal. But let's hold everyone accountable and to standards, whether you have a GNU or not. because we've seen at local government level that coalitions haven't worked that well. You know, it's been a major challenge, and we've had too great a turnover of leadership. And then sadly, the administration hasn't been professional in order to function, whether there's a government or not. So you look at Belgium. There was a number of years when Belgium couldn't get their act together to have a government in place, but the public service functioned. And it's because there was understanding of professionalism. Ironically, we've got Section 195 in the Constitution that's very clear about the role of the public service, but it's as though everyone has dismissed it, you know. So call that a king with a difference, you know, King 4 with a difference. But I think it's just because all along the value chain, you know, there's the issue of almost disengagement in a strange way. And what we need now is optimism. Look, we're at a tipping point. We've got to make a difference, and it doesn't matter which party you belong to. You've got to push for change. So it can't be about self or the party. It must be about the people. Because as a Nigerian economist once says, he says, the rich won't sleep when the poor don't sleep, and especially if the poor are hungry. Because they'll come after you. It doesn't matter how high your walls, how punitive your security services are. You need to change society as a whole for the benefit of everyone. You know, and that's what we've got to look at. And how do we do it? Because it's not a spectator sport. It's not rugby or soccer. It's life, you know, that we need to change.
Thank you, Dr. Fraser. I think you touched on, I think, a very important theme, the sense of teaming, of working together. I think in Nelson Mandela Bay, I think specifically with the Nelson Mandela Business Chamber, I think many of the people that we have in the room are members of the chamber, and they do know and understand that we try and push to make sure that there is this sense of teaming, this sense of working together and support that we give to, I'll call it, to government. Talking about the local municipality. I just want to now move the conversation to Africa as a whole, because
Okay.
if you're from Africa,
We from Africa, right?
yes, we're from
Yes.
Africa, but people
The
that
rest
are
of Africa.
the rest of Africa,
Yeah.
yes, the rest of the people that are not from Africa, they talking about misinformation, Alfie. They've got this sense that if you look at Africa, Africa is full of leaders who are not ethical, whether it's in business or in government. How do we then work together as a continent to try and change that perception?
Wow, so all these Africans in the room, how do you feel about everyone thinking you unethical, you've got a bad name and all? You know, someone said, I don't know if it was the Economist or Time, that once had a front page. The media people will know that said Africa has failed completely. And then later there was Rising Africa. Look, the reality is that there may well be this perception, but it's also a generalization. Because I think if we look at our neighbor Botswana, Botswana has been seen as one of the most stable economies in Southern Africa. It went through a bit of a bump, but I think it's coming back. So you can look at Botswana. We can also give different examples elsewhere, you know. So Yes, it's a generalization, but I think to a large degree, I suppose we should earn the issue of saying Africa is not a failed continent. We have ethical leaders and all. Now, you know, we had this mechanism called, we still have it, called the African peer review mechanism. The purpose of the African peer review mechanism, and mind you, business is involved in, there's a business chamber of sorts to this. It's linked to the whole, to NEPAD itself. The purpose of it is to hold leaders accountable, and they're held accountable by their peers. Now, it worked. It took off on to, there was a slow start in the beginning, because it's not very comfortable when you as a head of state are accountable to your peers for what's happening in your country, whether it's the economy, whether it's social, political, or other aspects. So I had the good fortune during the 50th anniversary of Ghana to be in the meeting or when the peer review was done of Nigeria, Uganda, and I think South Africa. We did one of our reviews there. And it's because I was the focal point for South Africa, so I was able to join the heads of state meeting. I think the one thing in the late Deputy Minister Aziz Pahat, at the end of that session, he came out and he said, geez, I never knew that there's such robust engagement. I don't think it happens anywhere in the world. So let me just sketch the scenario. So each country has a report, a country report that is done by the APRM team. You've submitted your own country report, which is self-assessment. That's done by government, business, and civil society. But aside to the country's self-assessment, there's then the assessment done by the peer review panel. And that report is engaged on by the heads of state and government. Now, for you to be able to engage in a real sense, you need to either have got a very good report from your Sherpa, or you should have read it. And it was in that meeting where the various heads of state were engaging one another. And for example, one issue that was raised around Uganda at the time was the fact that they had just discovered oil around that time. And you know, the East African oil pipeline is still a big issue that's underway at this point. But they were engaged on that, and he actually said to, it was President Yaradua of Nigeria at the time, he said to President Yaradua, he said, you know, in Uganda at this point, we've only got one engineer that deals with the issue of oil and all that geological whatever. He says, I'd like to engage with Nigeria to get some experience. Well, Nigeria wasn't quite the best example at that point because of the regulations around oil and all that, you know, and how they were dealing with it. But I think that engagement is what you need, where again heads of state and government hold each other accountable, but they can only do that when they're completely honest with one another. So you can't have such a session where you think it's going to be one of platitudes, where, you know, even when dealing with conflict settings, you're going to hold back, and you can only do that in a closed room. You know, in South Africa, you have unemployed people saying, we don't want foreigners taking our jobs, and foreigners are seen as other Africans. And the irony is the jobs that may be spoken about may be in the financial sector. If you don't have skills, if you haven't been trained in it, you, Sia, can get that job, but not a guy who's in the northern areas that haven't passed JC or matric. And we've got to change that. And I suppose this is where the business chamber comes into play as well, where you look at entrepreneurship and how are we going to get more internships? Are we teaching young people to code? Can we get coders here that are different from anywhere else, you know? So I've said a lot of things, and I've generalized a lot as well, yeah?
Thank you, Doctor. I think you touched on universities, I think, getting involved. I think I'm one person to say, look, I'm happy. Like I said, I studied at NMU. When I was doing my second year at NMU, I was actually very excited when they introduced a module on ethics. I think for most of us, it was a bit of a surprise, but at the end of the day, we kind of like understood why, because already you could see what was happening in the country, not only in the country, in the continent.
But
in
you
the rest
don't
of
only
the world.
study ethics because of what's happening in the country. You
So-
study ethics because it's necessary to
Yes.
do it anywhere in the world.
Exactly. I
Okay.
think for me, I guess the link was there because it's like, okay, look, we're introducing this module that none of us had expected, but at the same time we understood what maybe could have been the reason behind it. Maybe just want to put
Professor
Prof
Geert.
on the spot.
Yes.
He's sitting there at the back, maybe just to comment. But when you finish, Prof, commenting, I think I just want to give an opportunity to our audience. I'm just looking at the time. Maybe an opportunity to ask questions, and then thereafter we will then wrap it. Prof.
Yeah, in fact, universities are peculiar institutions actually in any social setup, and it has a big responsibility. And I do think because most of the professional skills that land up, whether in public or in private, one time or the other, it has taken a route through higher education. And given that role of universities that more or less touches so many of the professions, whether it's private or public higher education institutions, it has a huge responsibility, not only in the current context, but it should have as the purpose of the university a responsibility to produce cultures within which ethical leadership can flourish and can be produced. And so and universities have not always played that role because it's also social institutions that are, under threat of being captured themselves, like so many of our different types of institutions that we have here. But in a sense, it's also, especially in this African context, but also on our continent, it's also one of the more stable social institutions that you can find across various types of political organization in the different types of countries, even internationally as well. And part of the reason why universities have to interface with business much more stronger, almost like a hand in glove, is precisely to have its own social legitimacy protected in that particular ecosystem between public and private. I always argue that public goods gets generated by the private and the public. Doesn't mean that you're private, that you are not producing public goods. I think that this chamber has shown on so many fronts, how it produces public goods and public goods for common purposes, just in the reports that we get as board members as well. And at that interface, I think there's the chance that there's like a golden space available for us between public, private, state, and civil society. And I do think that if I can venture something for the future, I do think that our national consciousness must be disinvested from a state that provides. And rather think how we can have different other forms of organization, either next to the state, along with the state, hand in glove with the state, beyond the state, through the state. But the idea of a steering state, I think, is something that is not going to take us where we think, our society should be going. It should be really an equalizing partnership between different social partners.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. Fraser, I'm not sure if you want to comment on that before we questions. Yes.
Then
Okay.
I'll come back.
Just a quick one on the terms of, you mentioned about the AG and then we're looking at the PFMA and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have a system of supposedly accountability, but there's no consequences. And my question always is that, you know, there is a system in place. Why is it not adhered to? And it's simple. So I don't know if you've got any comment. I mean, you being in government for quite a while, I mean, you would have seen under Nelson Mandela and Mbeki that things were going quite well, PFMA was run well, and all of a sudden it just fell apart after that. I don't know if you know what actually happened there.
You know, I mean, you're quite right that there is a need for consequent management. You know, it's very important. Look, we didn't use the word corruption today. And the reality is that there's been corruption, I think, not only in government, it's private sector as well. And I think, remember, it's where the interface between private and public sector happens that corruption really thrives. You know, it's not as though it's happening in government in isolation of whatever. And the second issue, and it goes back, and I suppose one has been skirting around it, it's around leadership and poor leadership. You know, because at the end of the day, to effect the controls that are required, that are there, you need leadership to ensure that people act. And it goes back to the issue of accountability, you know. Lack of consequence management, you have, it's not as though it's been entirely missing, you know. It's happened in instances. But I suppose it's not been effected evenly in all instances where it should have. And it requires the various arms of the state to work well. You know, the judiciary is a separate arm of the state. It should function well. The legislature is separate. And we talk about the independence of the three arms. Parliament, legislature, the judiciary, and the administration, government. And I think each arm of the state must hold the other accountable. But then within the state, there's a need for the various agencies to work well. So there's, and I'm going to bring a bit of a difficult issue in the room. You know, to a large extent, we should also ensure that the security services do their job. Because, so security services, that the prosecutorial authorities do the job that they are required to do. And they mustn't try and sensationalize issues, because that's why they sometimes will jump for what they think is a low-hanging fruit and then have egg on their faces. I think they need to do what's required consistently and in a manner that's required. And at this point in time, I don't think we've had a number of commissions, spent a lot of money on commissions. And unfortunately, we had commissions without growing the economy. And you can't have either or. You need to run this parallel. And the arms, the various arms of the state must function and do their work well. If you've got, let's use Nelson Mandela Bay. If your police services are completely rotten from top to bottom, you can't expect the consequence management that you require. And I think maybe it's time to do something that we tried a bit in the early 90s, and that's rotate public servants in particular areas of specialization and actually move them out to other areas. Because then hopefully you can also crack some of the syndicates that are in place. So an area that I am involved in from a non-executive director point of view is the mining sector. And we know that there are huge syndicates in the mining sector. And here you have private sector and criminal syndicates operating sometimes in, they work together. And there's a need to break that down. So it actually requires, and to the point that Prof. Keert made, it requires the private sector, public sector, and civil society to work together. For as long as communities won't hand over people who they know are involved in criminal activities, we're not going to solve these problems. But mind you, it's not only communities in townships, it's even in the suburbs. It's people who may be running garages with luxury cars, and they know that there's money laundering going, taking place through that, where you know, somebody buys a Maserati, you keep it in a place for 2 years, and they come and then, I don't know whether it's they sell that Maserati or they buy it back, but it's also fancy ways of laundering, and this is private sector. It's not public sector. So it's consequence management at every level of society and cutting it across everyone. What went wrong in government? I think we all know, when my CV was read, it said I resigned in September 2008. I resigned in 2008 based on principle. And I did that because there was a recall of the head of state at that point in time. And I said, you can't recall a head of state and you don't dissolve cabinet. It goes contrary to the constitution of the country. So it's individuals being able to take take a stand on issues, even if it may come at a personal cost. And I think, unfortunately, at the moment, not everybody is ready to do that, irrespective of whether they're in the public sector or in the private sector or even civil society. I have and I haven't answered your question.
Good afternoon, Doc. What I would like to know from you, in a world we're in, it's male-dominated, both private and public in leadership. As a female, how did you survive? And as well as, I want to know, you've been in a position of power and, you know, in decision making and all. And speaking of corruption or unethical things that are happening, weren't you at some point, you know, in a position of danger where they would threaten you or your immediate members, like family members, if you don't agree with what they want?
So maybe let me start with the second one, the last question, and I'll go back. And I want to use not quite an analogy. I always take an approach that if you close space, then it will be closed. So if you say, I fear because, and I won't do because I fear my life, you actually allow people to take your agency away from you. And it narrows space for people to act. So if you go to the US at this point in time, there's also an element of fear. People are not sure how to act. At universities, there's a bit of a challenge, you know, and you know, universities are supposed to be the place where there's academic freedom, young people do what they do as young people, resist. We saw it from the time of the Vietnam War in the States or else, and up to today. And the concern one has is the minute people accept this fear, there's danger, and they contract that space, it gets taken away from you. So on the issue of personal safety and fear, you know, I've done interesting things in my life, let me put it that way. So, and have always said, so the one thing that's clear, anyone who would come to me and say, oh, you know, I believe when I was minister that you have a particular procurement that's going to come out, particularly through GEMS, the Government Employee Medical Scheme. We'd like you to influence. And I said, no, 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 I'm not involved in procurement. I don't do that. There's a process and you follow the process. So don't come to me. And I think that was known. People get to know. Eventually they'll say, no, no, you can't go to her because she's not going to assist. She won't be an enabler, you know. And I think it's putting that out there. And it may be difficult in the beginning because it may be people you know and people you may even have liked up to that point in time. But you'll simply say, no, but it's not done that way. And I think there's not sufficient of that. And also because there's an element of self-enrichment. So in instances, people will say, oh, that funding goes wherever, but they may skim off a percentage as well. So it's dealing with those issues, and you know, you put the peg in the ground early on, and people will know. So even now, I mean, people will come to me and I said, no, I don't do that. For as long as I am where I am, that I do not do. I'll only, and in business, they have this thing called declaring conflict of interest, you know. People use shortcuts around that and think a declaration is a declaration, but it's simply saying it will not be done. On the issue of different spaces and women, lack of women, numbers of women, I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that over the past 30 years, South Africa has actually opened to women leadership to a very great extent. And we even do better in business than North America does, if you look at women in the C-suite. But you should never become complacent. So that's in the private sector. In the public sector, when we got into government, there were 10 women in national government, 10 across. And that had changed, and it was because of clear programs to make it happen. But let me say, when people come in, they come in on merit as well. So it's not because you're a woman that you will be lesser. Because at the end of the day, I mean, over the past 30 years, especially the middle classes, could send their kids to more or less the same schools. So boys and girls went through the same qualification and studies. The challenge is that there's not always been a sponsor for a girl, as there may be for a boy. I mean, men or women, and we need to look at it. I think the place that I was in where there were the least women, and I'll put this out there now because it's public, was when I joined the military wing of the ANC. And I think we were 4 women in a battalion at some point in time. So that was different. Do you feel insecure and all? There was a code, and that code was adhered to, and people couldn't cross lines. So it's to the point he made, consequence management. I think we don't sufficiently have codes and ethical codes that will make us feel secure. Because, you know, a lot of what we've done, we didn't do for ourselves. We did it for the beautiful ones yet to be born. I fortunately got 3 of them already, and there are 2 more coming. So it's for those ones that we walk the hard roads. And it's for those ones that we think South Africa must change to be South Africa that belongs to everyone. Black and white, men and women. I mean, we must go to the preamble of our Constitution. And if we want to talk about ethics, Sia, look at the preamble of the Constitution. Look at the founding provisions. It's just incredible what's there. And we behave as though we don't have a blueprint. And we do. And this blueprint was drafted by founding parents, you know. But we should, and I think you raised it, that we should teach our kids to be proud of being South African, to be proud of, in our living history, having had a constitution that was crafted the way it is, to be proud of just what that constitution represents, and saying we're going to live up to that country, and we're not going to let anyone come into our way who wants to divert. And that's where the business chamber needs to and is playing its role to make that difference. And yes, it's difficult. It's difficult. And look, anything that's too easy can't be the real thing. You know, we've got to walk the hard yards. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Fraser. I'm just looking at the time. I'm not sure if there's one last question. If not, I think we need to bring it to a close.
This one, yeah.
Just the last one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Geraldine. If you were to be asked for a bit of I see we're talking about ethical leadership and positive change. And if we were saying for a little bit of a blueprint for creating positive change. So in a scenario where you're brought in onto a board or into an organization to support it, where perhaps it became captured or it lost its moral fiber, and now you want to support it to find its way back. So one clear indication you gave is to help everyone to put a pole in the ground now and say, I don't do this, you know, and just stick to that consistently. I wondered if you wouldn't add a couple of other practical blueprints for bringing about positive change to right a ship that maybe lost its way a bit. I think I'm putting far too many analogies in, but I'm sort of saying if we're going to lead something back, you're a leader who's come in with passion, and how would we got younger people going, okay, I'm looking to you now, what can I do as I start to make sure I don't fall for it? Because younger people tend to follow their leaders, you know, they tend to want to be in support of their leaders. How can they be part of positive change, and especially come into a place where change is now very much required? Is that clear enough?
Yes. You know, people must be ready to speak out. You need an open environment in which there's accountability. But it also means that leadership at different levels must be confident in themselves to make that change possible. So you can have, let's call it safe spaces. So in a work environment, whether it's public or private sector, you say once a week, you bring your team into a room. And you ask the team, what can we do to improve the culture in this place? What is it that is problematic? What makes it opaque in this workplace? But you must be ready to hear the things you may not want to hear. It doesn't mean that you accept everything that's brought to the table, because you should also engage. So have a space where, you know, you have open discussion, even contestation. But when you conclude that meeting, you'll say, this is what we've decided. And it's, so again, transparency, it's openness, it's accountability, and everyone is accountable. So in the African Development Bank, I worked with a very diverse team. Somalian, Italian, British, Sudanese, Gambian, and so it goes on, Rwandan and all. And we used to sit once a week to just review how we're working, what we could do better and all. And it's especially because we were in a very contested space. It's to the earlier question that was raised. So women being in a space, and I was brought into the African Development Bank to work on the strategy that looked at inclusion, and in particular women's economic inclusion on the African continent and through the bank's programs. And the one way was, of course, looking at which areas are the areas you've got to be in if you want to make a difference quite early, sort of early in the process. And the one is what the bank calls the operations committee. And we sat on the operations committee. So we'd meet weekly and just discuss issues. And of course, it was very robust, you know, very diverse views, divergent views and all. But you allow the voices to be heard. And at the end of the day, you say, okay, out of the 10 things that's come on the table, I actually think you quite unfair, and you probably didn't understand the context on 6 of that. But there are 4 issues that should be considered. But it's also about being bold. You know, you must be ready to be bold to make a change, because you can't just meet with people and at the end of the day you have another meeting and people say, so what happened, you know? So it's being ready to push change. So it's about change management. And I can go through what the specifics are in theory, but that you can read about. You know, you don't need that. It's what do we do in practice? And practice is about doing the really difficult things and supporting people and working in a collective. It's to the point that Sia raised in the beginning. It's about collectives, because individuals, you have exceptional individuals like President Nelson Mandela, and they can be catalysts, but they always operated in collectives. I mean, you also look at President Thabo Mbeki, I think one of the sharpest intellectuals on the African continent, and he'll challenge you on various things. Also didn't suffer fools easily, you know, and that's why it intimidated some people and so on. But you knew that everything that he's received is read, and even more. So you better know your stuff. But there's a collective behind that. But also vision, being visionary and being ready to make a difference, you know, and looking at what are the niche areas that needs to be dealt with. And sometimes it's just getting the basics right. So in Nelson Mandela Bay, it's about getting the basics right. So we can have the big dreams, and there's some amazing things around Kucha and the big projects, but it's also getting the basics right. Do we have the waste management right in all areas? Or are people thinking that waste management is only dealt with in select areas? You know, dealing with the water challenges, dealing with electricity, and it's the stuff you're doing. So and this is for the public service. Public service must go back to basics now. They must get the basics right again, and then move to the bigger things. And yes, we need innovation, but we need to deal with the fundamentals.
Thank you, Dr. Fraser. I think I like your comment about dealing with the basics. Unfortunately, because of time, I think we need to bring it to a close. But thank you very much for honoring us with your presence. I think the
Thank you.
biggest takeaway for me is that we all have a responsibility to hold each other accountable. And I think it's something that we are doing here in Nelson Mandela Bay, specifically through the Business Chamber and just through the community that we have in Nelson Mandela Bay. Thank you very much. I'm just going to hand over now to Kelvin just with the closing remarks, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sia. Dr. Geraldine, the Business Chamber is perfectly aligned with what you spoke about, and for instance, we have an entrepreneurship desk focusing on mentorship of our future leaders, a skills development desk focusing on the gaps that we discussed just now, not just technical gaps. Now maybe it's girl power because our current and previous CEOs were both accomplished women, so maybe that's why it's well aligned. But it's definitely areas that we see as gaps in business as well. I really appreciated your opening story about President Mandela and Mbeki. I think we often misunderstand ethical leadership and servant leadership to imply easy on standards. It is quite reassuring to know that these two great men were still, I've got to choose my words carefully here because I want to say hard something, but this is going, but you know what I'm saying. But they didn't tolerate bad performance, they didn't tolerate being late for meetings. This is, you know, that is quite reassuring to someone like me. And then finally, Sia, just on the African position, yes, the negative press or the negative stories usually get more public attention, but 2008 subprime crisis, we survived.
Yes.
Asian crisis 97, we survived. And we survived because of our controls that we have in place. So
And leaders.
and leaders.
At the time. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we're not as bad as we'll have a discussion outside a little bit later. Okay. Dr. Geraldine, it's been an honor to have you here. I could go on for another 4 pages on how honored and proud I am to be in the same room as you, let alone engage with you. It has been something I've been looking forward to personally for a very long time, and I appreciate that, and the Business Chamber extends its thanks to you as well. Sia, as always, well done. All in one take, no editing, so. And to our guests, thank you very much for making this successful, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.